That experience is what we call consciousness. We are conscious of both the external world and our internal selves. We are aware of an image in much the same way we are aware of ourselves looking at an image, or our inner thoughts and emotions. But where does consciousness come from? Scientists, theologians, and philosophers have been trying to get to the bottom of this question for centuries without reaching any consensus. As we approach questions of consciousness with science, we'll open new lines of inquiry into human identity.
Dobry, cześć. Tak więc, moi drodzy, w obszarze świadomości absolutnie nic się nie zmieniło. Nadal nikt nic nie wie. W związku z tym pragnę Was pocieszyć i podbudować morale, bo prawdopodobnie jesteście mądrzejsi od tych wszystkich panów tutaj i całego zastępu naukowców, który się wykluł od tamtych lat. Mam tu kilka przykładów, ale nie musicie tego ani słuchać, ani oglądać, chyba że se przewincie trochę do przodu i wyłapiecie jakieś interesujące fragmenty. Tutaj to pierwsze to tak zwany bełkot totalny, natomiast pod koniec będzie tam pan gadał, którego już znacie sprzed lat, bo był u nas na kanale i on mówi o świadomości poza mózgiem. A jak dotrwacie do końca, to tam powiem jeszcze parę słów na pożegnanie. No to tyle. Słuchaj, tak jak chceta, nie chceta, to wyłączajcie, pa.
Nevin is the Vice President of Engineering at Google, and he's the founder and manager of the Quantum Artificial Intelligence Lab at Google. Today, Hartmut proposes something I find fascinating, which is, look, Penrose thinks that when you have a quantum superposition and you collapse, you produce a conscious event. Hartmut believes the opposite. Perhaps when you have a superposition created, that is what produces consciousness.
This conscious moment is created by quantum processes, and it has to do with experiencing a single classical reality, even though quantum mechanics tells us there's this multitude, that you also get at the moment of creation of a superposition. So it's important. The key lesson here is that quantum physics tells us that every object exists as a multi-object, and we have to keep track of all these possible configurations simultaneously.
My question is, with your idea that it's superposition that is related to consciousness and also agency, which you keep connecting it to, isn't whether a state is, and I might be understanding this wrong, whether a state is in superposition or not depends on the basis of states in which you measure?
Scott, go ahead. And then I have a question too.
Hartmut, suppose hypothetically that someone believed that like quantum mechanics is universally valid, but consciousness is some, higher level, emergent neuronal thing. And so, all of these experiments, what they're going to do is reconfirm quantum mechanics over and over, but at no point will any consciousness ever be implicated in it. Like, would you have an argument that that person is wrong?
Professor, what are your views on solipsism and the role of consciousness, observer, in creating reality? Is this similar to the problem of anything goes?
No. Our particular way of observing reality is a concrete phenomenon in the actual world. It's not anything goes. Take the moon illusion again. My conscious experience, can't get over it, can't overcome it, is that the moon is big at the horizon. With all you might know, the greatest astronomer in the world will still see that. That's our conscious experience. Well, is it creating reality? No. Reality is not that the moon is bigger. Discover that in other ways. Therefore, nobody believes that the moon is bigger, even though that's all that we see, and there's no explanation for it. Still don't believe it because there's so much counter evidence. So you don't create reality that way. Now, there's a sense in which our immediate experience creates reality. It's the kind of issue that's raised by, in a very interesting way, by Nelson Goodman, particularly, outstanding philosopher, in his work on what he calls star making. So he begins by asking the question, take a look at the constellation, say Orion. Is the constellation a thing in the world? or is it a construction of our mind? What he calls a version of the world. It's a construction of our mind. It's a version. Then he goes on to say, well, what about the stars that constitute Orion? Are they things in the world? Or are they just a version? He concludes they're a version. We could talk about what we talk about stars. We could talk about in other ways, like concentrations of energy and the general flux of energy in the universe and so on. And then he goes on to say, well, is there anything that isn't just a version? Is there any reason to ask what do we gain by postulating a reality behind the versions? And goes interesting discussions. There's a book on this with his introduction commentary by a number of other philosophers, Hilary Putnam, Israel Scheffler, others, I think Carl Hampel. Those are interesting questions. I can't give a simple answer to them. But there is some kind of sense in which our immediate perceptions are the basis for developing our notion of reality. Actually, Russell talked about this about a century ago, when he was saying that if you think about, he says, our highest level of confidence is in our immediate sensory, our immediate consciousness. That's our highest level of confidence. And then most of the rest of what we do in inquiry is trying to find an explanation for it. Part of the explanation we find is that our consciousness misleads us. It tells us things that aren't true about them. That's one of the things we discover when we try to find an explanation for the consciousness, which is the thing we have highest confidence in. I think he's basically on the right track.
Rounded of ecclesiastical dogma. And so now we're just beginning to break out of that. And so now we are exploring it, and science then is now the person or the entity that is most involved in trying to impede us from what we're doing. And we are now overcoming science as well as we overcome the church. And so that's the period in which we're in now. It's an exciting period in which we're discovering for the first time in humankind's history the real nature of consciousness and reality.
I thought this was an okay way to do science.
Yeah, the scientists have been taken out of it. And the reason for that is that the scientists want to believe that the mind is created by the brain, is housed in the brain. The memories are stored in the brain. And because of that limited point of view, then they won't allow themselves to consider anything else. And so they ignore all of the rest of what we know to be true today. Because we have the data. We have the data to show that the mind is not in the brain. The mind is doing things outside of the brain. In remote viewing, for instance, we can sit someplace and we can view things that are thousands of miles away. That can't happen if the 3 to 5 pounds of tofu-like mush inside of our skulls is all there is to consciousness. So
that's
consciousness
true. That's
is outside. Yeah,
right.
Consciousness is outside of the skull. It's outside of the brain. And as a result of that, because we know that consciousness is outside of the brain, then we have to explain where is consciousness and what is consciousness. And so we have a whole new set of questions open. The same thing's happening now. They just won't look at the data. They say, no, we won't look at that. And they all come together and they all agree that they're not going to look at it and that it is pseudoscience and there's nothing to it. And so
they're not allowed to.
They're not advancing.
So amazing to me.
So what they're trying to do is to come up with alternatives to put the mind into the brain somehow, and so they come up with explanations that they believe are going to eventually put the mind in the brain. There's the whole brain hypothesis, then, that the whole brain is involved, and because the whole brain is involved, that's why you can't find where consciousness is. And they believe that the memories are stored in the brain.
I have seen those. They can't do anything about it.
So what we have now is we have, since we know that the mind can't be in the brain, We
Yes.
have remote viewing where we can view things that are thousands of miles away. We have psychic abilities where people can know things about other people that they couldn't possibly know. We have Ganzfeld experiments in which people are able to predict the cards that are going to be shown. We have the Dean Radin's experiments with the computer in which the computer brings up images at random and the person is reacting to the images that are coming up at random on the computer 6 to 7 seconds before they're chosen by the computer. So we have all kinds of information now
Right.
to demonstrate the fact that the mind couldn't possibly be in the brain. It has to be outside of the brain. And so now we're looking at it differently. So now we're saying, well, if the mind isn't in the brain, where in the world is it? And so then we say that it's not in the world. And that's part of the reason that we know that this is true. That the mind is much greater than that. In fact, we are all part of one universal consciousness, our universal intelligence, and we are one with it. So there is nothing but our universal intelligence, and we then are having experiences within it in our minds, but we are not, our minds are not limited to what's inside of the brain. So that energy that we know now is consciousness. So we know that that's true. Science is helping us to understand that. We know that in this energy world that we are in, there are no colors in this energy world. There are no sounds in this energy world. It's all just energy. And then our minds are what give it color. Our minds are what give it sound, and our minds give it meaning. And so then our experiences are coming from consciousness. Our consciousness are related to each other. And at the basis of it all is our universal intelligence, and that is.
No i tak wygląda sytuacja ze świadomością. Nie wiemy, skąd się wzięliśmy, co my tu robimy na tej ziemi i dokąd zmierzamy. Nikt nic nie wie, moi państwo. Nie udało mi się złapać zorzy, szkoda, ale pogoda była lipna, a to mi się nie chciało, a to zaspałem, a to budzik nawalił. Majówka była udana, grillowaliśmy z pełną świadomością na potęgę. No i koniec filmu, trzymajcie się cieplutko, pozdrawiam serdecznie, papa.